All right, so I think that leaves nothing else but for me to introduce our speaker. I'm going to read Jim Shallow's bio. We are so excited to have him here tonight. So Jim Shallow is the Director of Strategic Conservation Initiatives for the Nature Conservancy's Vermont chapter. In this role, he is project lead on the Burnt Mountain Carbon Project, Vermont's largest single-tract carbon project. Jim is also a team member of TNC's Working Woodlands program, which has developed carbon projects across the United States, covering over 200,000 acres. He is a member of the American Forest Foundation's Woodlands Operating Committee that oversees the American Tree Farm program and advises AFF on developing carbon markets that will support management on family forests. Prior to joining TNC, Jim Shallow worked for Audubon, Vermont, where he led the Forest Bird Initiative that developed the award-winning Forests for the Birds silvicultural guides in partnership with Vermont's Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and for joining me on this beautiful, Thursday afternoon when the sun is shining. So thanks for taking the time out of this beautiful day to talk about this important subject. So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about why this is an important subject. Spend a little time just talking about natural climate solutions and the carbon markets that have emerged out of that. And then really dive into the Family Forest Carbon Program, the particulars about it, and then some of the practices that we are now envisioning using in this program. And then we'll try to leave it open for as long as possible for questions. And so I'm going to hopefully not overwhelm you with slides, but I'm going to jump right into it with this beautiful picture of a moose. Right now, the world, our world faces dual crises of rapid climate change and an unprecedented biodiversity loss. And the key factor in both of these crises is the rate of change. For climate, the carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas that has contributed to global warming, about 3/4 of that has been emitted by humans since 1945. Likewise, the biodiversity loss over the past 50 years is extremely high. According to a recent assessment, there's been a nearly 70% average decline of birds, amphibians, and mammals, fish, and reptiles since 1970. And the global rate of species extinction is currently 10 to hundreds of times higher than it is average over the past 10 million years. And we're seeing this play out right here in Vermont. This moose, we're seeing this population stressed as our climate warms up and our winters aren't as long, and the winter ticks that prey on these on moose are able to survive the winters, and the lower snowpack allows them to latch onto moose. And so their population is stressed by having literally tens of thousands of ticks latch on to these moose, and they die from anemia. So and their range is shifting. So there's a lot of stresses going on, and what we're also hearing from the scientific community is that these dual challenges have to be addressed together. I don't know if you saw this in the New York Times a few days ago. There was an article on the International Panel on Climate Change and the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services issued a report. And I just want to read a quote from it. It's, "Unprecedented changes in climate and biodiversity driven by human activities have combined increasingly to threaten nature, human lives and livelihoods, and well-being around the world. Biodiversity loss and climate change are both driven by human economic activities and mutually reinforce each other. Neither will be successfully resolved unless both are tackled together." And so they issued a report on this, and this dual approach is something that we at the Nature Conservancy, we're devoting our energy to, is to tackle both of these crises. And this subject really brings the two together. And so I want to spend the next few minutes talking about how that's happening, so that then we can get into ways that you as landowners can start thinking about how you can play a role in tackling both of these challenges that is facing the globe. So there was a 2017 study led by the Nature Conservancy that found that the land sector around the globe has the potential to deliver up to 1/3 of the cost-effective mitigation needed by 2030 to hold the global warming to 2 degrees Celsius while supporting biodiversity. So we as a country now are back in the climate, the Paris Accords, and our country, our state, many businesses around the world have pledged to try to work to keep our warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And to do this, we need to not only stop or limit the amount of fossil fuels we're burning and the carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere, but we also have to start taking the carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere out. Think about it like emptying a bathtub. You want to turn off the faucet, and then you also want to pull the drain and open that drain up as wide as possible to empty that out. And so natural climate solutions, things like forests and wetlands and farmlands, if we change the way that we manage those, can play a big role, up to a third of meeting that, helping us meet that goal. And so what I want to talk about and focus on today are really these three. So we're talking about protecting forests, managing our timberlands better for more carbon storage and sequestration, and then also restoring forests, so places where we can do reforestation. And primarily tonight's topic is going to be focused on managing timberlands. But to help us get to those goals, markets have emerged to help companies meet those goals. And so we know that carbon plays a role in our forests, right? Trees have this magical power of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, converting it to sugars. They use those sugars to grow, and then they store that residual carbon in the trunks, in the leaves, and eventually in the soils of our forests. And if we can do things to protect our forests, keep them as forests, that will help store and sequester carbon. And I want to emphasize that there's kind of two concepts here, right? There's sequestering carbon, you'll hear that a lot, and that's that process of the trees pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere. And then there's storage, and that storage is when it all gets held into the trunks and wood in the soils. And that's the things that the markets are looking at, is how can we improve the amount of carbon being sequestered and stored above what is already happening. So it's that additionality that the marketplaces are really trying to capture and find a way to pay landowners to do that. So one way that that's happening is through projects like our Burnt Mountain project up in northern Vermont. So this is a kind of a traditional forest carbon project. It's on 5,400 acres. And we bought it a few years ago. It had been managed forest land. And we made the decision when we bought it that we were going to transfer the management into a forever wild status. And that difference in management is the additionality that we are now calculating and selling on the carbon market. So I'm going to show you a couple really quick graphic, kind of cheesy graphic slides to show you what's going on. So the way the markets work is they look at a big block of forest land like this, and then it has all these benefits in addition to storing carbon. It's got recreational opportunities, great fishing, and it has wildlife habitat on there. And the markets want to reward you for doing that. So what they do is they look at what could have happened on the property. In this case, we could have cut the timber on the property down to a sea line level and stocking in order to restore the forest there. And that would have been a very much allowed by the state of Vermont. It's common practice. What we're doing instead is allowing it to grow old. So that difference between that baseline of what could have happened on the property and what is now happening as a forever wild forest, these dark trees, is that additional carbon that we go out and we inventory the property, and then model out what that change in use is, change in management, and then those become verified credits on the American Carbon Registry, which then can be bought by companies as offsets to their carbon footprint. So that's how the basic way that the carbon markets work. Unfortunately, it's very expensive to do one of these projects. You need big tracts of land to make it cost effective. And that's locked a lot of landowners here in Vermont out of these markets, because we have a lot of family forest owners that own, on average, like 160 to 250 acres across the state of Vermont. And yet we know that family forests are the biggest sector of land ownership in the United States. And so if we want to have forests play a larger role in meeting our carbon goals, the mitigation goals that we have, we need to find ways to have family forest landowners be able to access these markets. I'm going to skip over this. So what we've looked at is now developing the family forest carbon program. So this is a different approach. So unlike having the traditional carbon program where we pay landowners for the carbon sequestered, we monitor that on every property, and there's really high costs for monitoring on a per property basis. The family forest carbon program instead will pay landowners to implement specific practices that we have researched and shown will improve carbon stocks on the landscape over common forestry practices in the region. The monitoring of this takes place on every property, but we only monitor like a random sampling of those across all these properties on an annual basis. So it lowers the monitoring costs, which then allows us to have more, sort of a lower threshold for participation. So another way to look at it, so going back to my fun graphics here. So think about it this way: we have the same landscape. In this instance, it's broken up by a lot of different family ownerships, and there's invasives going on here. You might have a fully stocked forest up here, where a little thinning could help those trees grow a little faster and could sequester more carbon over time and store more as they get bigger. You might have a regeneration harvest going on here where you can clear all that out. So that activity is going on. Or you can take care of the invasives that are holding back the next cohort of trees growing up. So these are the kind of practices we're beginning to look at, or maybe even establishing reserves on these properties as well, like along this riparian area here. So as you implement these practices across the landscape, you see more trees are growing. And then what we do is we establish monitoring plots on these properties, and we come out and we'll monitor those and compare those to a baseline of plots that are being managed across the landscape by the U.S. Forest Service in an inventory called the Forest Inventory Analysis. You'll hear it referred to as FIA. And I'm going to get into this in just a minute when we start talking about how we modeled out these practices. So what do we do? So what we do is when you enroll in this, we will set up a contract. They generally last 10 to 20 years, and you'll get annual payments for implementing the practices that you've agreed to carry out on your property. The contract terms in general, you'll receive payments made throughout the period that are on a set schedule. You'll keep an up-to-date forest management plan. You'll keep us up to date on any changes in your management plan, and file a reporting form every 5 years. The Family Forest Carbon Program will own the rights to the carbon in the project area, and those carbon rights and the credits that are generated from your practices will be sold in the voluntary market to businesses and institutions that are looking to offset their practices. And then we'll periodically come out to visit and maybe conduct monitoring on your property. So those are the general contract terms that will be made available to people that may qualify for the practices. Generally, the payment schedule looks something like this: 20% upfront plus $800 for a management plan. If you need to update that in the years 2 through 8, you'll get 3% a year. In the next cohort of years, 4% plus another $800 in year 10 to update your management plan, and then 5% each year after that. And then finally, sort of in the last year, a 10% payment out to you. So we've been doing this as a pilot in Pennsylvania, in the Central Appalachians. Currently, we've signed up through the American Forest Foundation, signed up 57 landowners. They've enrolled 7,885 acres, roughly 136 acre average, and have committed $1.6+ million in incentive payments to those landowners. So we received a grant last year to expand this pilot to New England and to Massachusetts, Vermont, and Eastern New York. And when we applied for the funding, we told them our learning pilot would go on, and this would take place over the next few years. Our goal is to enroll 100 landowners, hopefully targeting 8,500 acres. During this learning pilot, we're going to go through the process of identifying which practices will work here in our geography and our forest types. We will be learning how to reach out to the landowners and what's the right way to engage with foresters, and be doing a lot of that learning to sort of figure out how do we get this going in our region, and then look to a further expansion in the next few years to the rest of Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine. So we're looking to do this launch this learning pilot in the early fall this year. And so what we've been doing since then is really focusing on the practice identification. So here's this map shows the area that we are focusing our learning pilot in. So it's the southern 6 counties of Vermont, the western counties in Massachusetts, and this eastern counties in New York. And this area sort of has similar forest types. There's 2 major forest types in it. There's the maple beech birch group. That's kind of what we're all used to seeing mostly in our forests. And then in the more southern part is the oak hickory forest type. There's a little bit of that in Vermont, but primarily we're looking at maple beech birch. And so what we've been doing is we went through a process of a stakeholder evaluation where we started to identify practices. And we started off with about 20 practices, and we had multiple experts come in, and we narrowed that list down to which ones were most beneficial for carbon and for adaptation of our forests and resiliency. And we came up with these. So there's a long list here. Yet we know that many of these won't be financially viable within the carbon markets, just given how much carbon is being costs these days in the markets and what it costs to carry out these practices. That said, all of these practices are good for forests and for a resilient forest in the face of climate change, as well as will help your forest store more carbon. So recognizing that these are all good, we're going to be releasing a workbook or a guidebook for you all and for people around the region that will really dive in deep to all of these practices and how they can be carried out on the landscape. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out later this summer and fall. But what we did is from this group, we started narrowing this down to a shorter list of practices. And these are looking at 4 which we thought would generate the best carbon response above the baseline that I'm going to get to in a minute here. These are establishing reserves, thinning with retention, removing competing vegetation, and then regeneration harvest with complexity. I'm going to go into that all over in detail here over the next few minutes here, and then I will open it up to questions. So we worked with a group called Spatial Informatics Group to model out the carbon benefits of these practices. And to do that, we looked at hundreds of inventory plots around New England set up by the Forest Inventory Analysis and came up with what is the carbon, how much carbon was being stored or maintained based on common harvest practices in the region. So we set a baseline based on what the FIA data was showing us over the last 20 years. And then we began to model out these practices and how they differ from that standard practice of forestry in our region, and how much more carbon per acre could be generated by a change in use. And so you'll see in these 4 practices here that there's a different rate of carbon being stored. Obviously, a reserve forest is going to store more carbon over the baseline because you're not going to do any harvesting, and those trees are just going to grow bigger over time. So you'll see the biggest bump in carbon is in that practice. That said, we really want to promote this program as a way to help landowners manage their land and provide them income for doing that. So we see this as a practice that's going to be fairly tight. And I'll show some of the specifications of that. The other 2 are in managed woodland. So this is creating regeneration complexity. And you'll see it's a little bit lower in the Maple Beach. The difference between the 2 Maple Beach there is one is sort of lowland Maple Beach, and the M211 that you'll see there is more what you'll find in Vermont. That's the mountain Maple Beach birch forest type. So these are the carbon benefits of this per acre, per year, per ton, metric ton of carbon equivalents over the baseline. And the other practice that we're looking at is enhancing future forests, which is basically removing competing vegetation like invasives or beech or other, striped maple that might be holding back the growth of the next generation of forest. So just to go into these a little bit here and not to spend too much time on them so I can take questions, establishing reserves would be essentially eliminating harvest activities over the 20-year period with an intent to continue that or beyond 20 years. This could cover all or a portion of the parcel. It must cover areas beyond legal requirements for reserves. So if you have areas that are in a riparian buffer or a wetland buffer, you couldn't include that. Stands must be at a commercial level. And for all of these practices, we're looking at stands that are generally at about 2,000 square feet per acre in basal area. That's what we're seeing as a commercial threshold for all of these practices. The ranking criteria that we're going to apply to this are large diameter trees, snags, and down wood, sites that have untilled forest soils, and are adjacent to permanently protected forest reserve areas. Regeneration with complexity. This is really an area where we're trying, if the landowner might be regenerating the forest. We want to limit that area to being harvested while retaining large trees and dead wood. So the carbon benefit is higher from the reduced area and with more retention being stored by the trees that are left behind. So no more than 20% of the project area would be harvested in the 20 years. And then within that harvested area, you would retain a minimum of 4 large diameter trees, and all snags and coarse woody debris would be retained in that regeneration cut. And then for the harvest, the thinning, retaining more carbon in thinnings, this is one that we think a lot of people are going to be interested in, and we're tweaking this, and we're still working with the modeling on it. But right now, we're sort of settling in on looking at no more than a 22% reduction in the basal area. No more than 50% of the enrolled stand would be harvested or thinned. No high grading, obviously large trees left behind, and then retention of snags and coarse woody debris. And then the last one, this one, the competing vegetation, we're really wrestling with this one. We know this is really important for the long-term benefit of the forest. Unfortunately, what's hard to show is a carbon benefit over the next 20 years. So this is really how this one comes out as a practice that we can pay for is still to be determined. We're not sure it's viable from a financial point of view within the carbon at the rate that the carbon markets are paying for carbon offsets right now, which is around $10 to $12 a ton. So this is one that's still in flux right now, but we're hoping to have that as a practice, but maybe with some other additional source of funding for it. because we do see that there's a carbon benefit out beyond the 20 years. It's just that we can't quite show enough of a bump in carbon over that first 20 years. So how to sign up? First question. So you want to, when we roll this out later in the fall, there's a program called Woods Camp. That'll be a tool that you can go on the internet to report your land and learn which practices might be right for you. If you're eligible, you can set up time to connect with a family forest carbon representative or a forester. We'll connect you with the forester who will walk your land. If it's your forester, we'll work with them to see if these practices are the best to fit in your situation. We'll put you together with the agreement, and then you'll sign that. It'll be a 20-year agreement, and payments will begin to start happening once we have that in place. And then we'll hire a professional or you'll work with your forester to complete the practice and your loggers and complete the reporting. So that's the basic way that this is all going to play out over the process. That said, we're moving ahead right now, trying to finish up our work on the practices this summer with the goal to rolling this out and doing the big launch this fall. So at that point, I think I've covered my half an hour, and maybe what I'll do, Ginevra, is stop share and we can start a conversation from there.
Thank you, Jim. Wow, yeah, it's 5:59, so you really you're a timekeeper. Yeah, thank you so much for running through the program. I learned a lot as someone who's not very familiar with it. So yeah, thank you. We've got some comments and questions here. So Michael and myself, I think, are kind of just going to go back and forth with those. Does that sound good, Michael?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll start with the first. It's a comment, but I thought I'd read it to you and give you a chance to say anything if you wanted to. Forever wild is fine, but a property where no harvesting occurs will allow the forest to get old, and then the sequestration rate reduces over time. The most important forests for sequestration today and in the future are middle-aged forests. They sequester the most over the landscape. So it's just a comment, but I just wanted to read it to you to make sure you heard it and had a chance to respond.
I do. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think there are benefits to carbon storage in old forests and forever wild forests, because what happens over time is the trees may not be sequestering as much, but the forest itself is storing more carbon, particularly more of that starts to get stored in the soils. And that's one of the challenges in the market right now, is we don't have a great way to sort of capture that carbon stored in soils and be able to credit that. So yes, and there's a benefit to that type of forest as well in the big scheme of things. When we did Forever Wild at Burnt Mountain, we were trying to address both the need for biodiversity and the state's goal to have more old forest in our landscape, as well as, and then we saw that there was an opportunity to help us pay for that acquisition by using the carbon markets.
Thank you, Jim. Another question is, do you have any specific ideas on how sugar makers can benefit? We tend to hold smaller acreage, but it's intensively managed towards larger trees. Specifically, we own 11.5 acres and lease 30 to 40. We have been managing it intensively for the past 36 years. How do we benefit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's going to come down to the specifics of sort of what you need to be doing at this particular cycle in your management, and whether any of these practices might come into play. It could be, and I'm just speculating here, that the thinning with retention might play a role there, as you're trying to maintain sort of the maple component in your forest and trying to lower that those other competing vegetation there. There may be a way to work through that. And again, it's going to come down to wanting to have a forester come out and take a look at that. At 40 acres, we're probably looking at sort of the lower threshold of what might work here for that practice. But again, that's some of what we're going to be tweaking out over the next few months here as we get into the final runs of these carbon models.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so, and then we have a pertinent question here, maybe to that question, which is there a minimum acreage for which landowners can enroll in the program?
So the way that the protocol is being set up through the VERA registry, this is the entity that will be verifying these credits and tracking all of this, is 30 acres is the minimum acreage, and the maximum is 2,400 acres. What we're wrestling with is like at that lower threshold around 30, if you start doing some of the math around some of these practices, you're starting to get down to like 6 acres that could be managed. And so then it becomes a question, is that viable commercially? So that's some of what we're working on right now.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, another one is, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, do your carbon sequestration numbers include soil carbon?
They do to some degree. The modeling, it accounts for some soil carbon, but the most of this is being captured in the tree growth because of the way that we did the modeling through using, there's a program called Forest Visual Simulator. I think I may have, yeah, and that sort of models out future growth. And so we use that for vegetation.
Okay, thanks.
Let's see. So how does this relate to the current use program with its tax abatement? Does the forest policy differ? So that the current use tax program they're referring to?
Yeah, so we're hopeful, and I'm pretty confident that these practices will all be consistent with our use value appraisal program standards and the requirements within that. The one that I'm just going to flag is the reserve one, which, you know, that's one we're gonna need to sort of have some more conversations with Forest Parks and Recreation and others about how that might be able to be applied and not like create problems for the landowner. There is a provision within current use for old forests through setting it up through what they call an ESTA, an ecological sensitive treatment area. And so there may be a way to use that provision to establish reserves on a property, which then would allow you to capture that practice and get payments for it. So that's the sort of some of the synchronization we're going to need to be working on over the next few months.
Another kind of obliquely related question, Jim, is can landowners opt out after 10 years? Also, what costs do the landowners incur in this program?
So the cost, so you are making a 20-year commitment. There may be practices that are shorter than that. They call it enhancing future forests. The competing vegetation piece may be a shorter practice for that, but these are 20-year contracts. So maintaining that carbon and that practice over the 20 years is going to be important for that. The second half of that question, can you say that again, Michael?
Yeah, also, what costs do the landowners incur in the program?
So the costs of to the landowner are largely, there may be some costs associated with if maybe your management plan update may be more than what we can provide for that. So there may be a little bit of us, we're subsidizing some of the costs of that management plan and you have to bear some of the rest of it. Other than that, there's a chance, and this is again what we're trying to sort out now, like some of these practices may, when it gets out on the ground, you may find that we may need to bring in a little bit extra money to cover the cost of that practice through NRCS equip practices or something like that. Not quite sure yet, but we're really trying to design this in a way that minimizes all costs to the landowner.
Dogs are barking in the back. You can ignore that. Are the carbon benefits sold only to businesses within Vermont?
No. So these will be credits that are available on the Vera registry and will be marketed to businesses and institutions across the country as that demand grows over the next 15 or 20 years. We're anticipating a large increase in demand for voluntary credits because of the number of companies that have made pledges to be carbon neutral over the next 10 to 20 years to meet their commitment to meeting the Paris Climate Accord goals.
So this is another question having to do with management planning. Building on Nancy's question, it says, I filed my current management plan in 2020 to run until 2030. Have there been conversations with county foresters regarding interruptions, et cetera, for these type of situations? They have 150 acres. So in other words, if they have a plan in place and managing through the family forest carbon program would entail changing that, what happens then?
Yeah, so I think in that instance, it's likely that if it could be that this practice fits in perfectly with your plan, right? It's like right on the mark. That would be the ideal situation. If it does need to be tweaked, you would need to do a plan amendment with your county forester. And that's where there would be some funds available to pay for your forester to do that plan amendment.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. So next question. If the carbon credits are sold, doesn't that incentivize large companies not to change? Doesn't the ability to buy carbon credits promote greenwashing and postpone our reckoning with nature's economy?
There's a huge philosophical question there, right? So yes, there is always a potential that a company could be using carbon offsets as a way to avoid making other choices. We at the Nature Conservancy, as well as our partners at AFF, have practices in place where we require companies buying these credits that this is like their last piece of the puzzle, so that they are implementing a full carbon plan for eliminating their emissions and their carbon footprint, right? So that would be things like changing business practices, using more electricity, as opposed, renewable electricity as opposed to carbon intensive power, things like that. And then in all of these, at this point, because our technologies have not caught up to where the need is, what we're finding over and over again is that there's generally that last 5 to 10% of that plan needs something to get them to neutral. And that's where offsets play a role. And we at the Nature Conservancy feel like that's really important right now to incentivize companies to do the right thing. And what we've seen is that and there's research out there that companies that are investing in carbon offsets generally are doing more than their peers in their industries to reduce their carbon emissions across the board. So it's a piece of the puzzle, and it's also a piece that can incentivize good corporate behavior.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Tim, that was a great question and a really good response. If you have any articles or research that you could send us, it doesn't have to be right now, but some links to that, we could share that with everyone, because that's a very important question that comes up a lot, and a concern that obviously many people have, who are really wanting to see an impact that's positive for the planet come out of these kinds of programs. So thank you.
Yeah, I will do that. And yes, and it's a good concern to have. And it's one that we all have to hold ourselves accountable for the actions we're taking.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is a very nuanced question. I'm curious as to how, if at all, this management model would be impacted by the emerging scientific understanding about how extensively trees cooperate, as opposed to being seen in a purely competitive model.
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that question, Michael. if we can capture that question, we have some really brainy people, who are really deep in Ethan Belair and some other folks that we're working with, including like folks at UMass and elsewhere, are really helping us sort out these the modeling here. And so I can take that question back to them and see if we can get an answer out of them.
That would be good. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind for me, which is a below the soil experience with, I do have some background in forestry and have done a lot of work. I found over time many examples of where tree roots have grafted so that there's actually quite a bit of connection between trees in a forest. I have not researched the extent to which that happens, but I think it's quite common, so that when you see a forest, you're often seeing many trees that are interconnected through actual exchange of sap through their roots. And that would be, and one example of how that really is true and can be verified is that when the Dutch elm disease came into many towns and all those beautiful trees were lining the streets, one tree would become infected and they would cut that tree down. And then even though that tree had been removed, the tree next to it would start getting infected. And what they found over time is that because the roots had grafted, that the infection, the fungal infection, had spread from tree to tree, not from the crown, but through the roots that still remained in the ground. So that, anyway, that's my 2 cents to that question. It's a really
that's
good
a whole,
question,
I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and
yeah,
just how these mother trees actually were, seeing that they will feed nutrients out to their offspring in a way that prefers them over other trees that are in that interconnected root network. It's just, so that could be a subject for a whole nother green tree.
Yeah, it's a very holistic way of looking at things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you. And this relates to actually the next question, which is just, can you provide a web link where one can read more about the program and how one might apply? So I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who's registered for this workshop with, I can send that link out, whatever Jim gives me, and I can also include an article if you find one, or a resource or an answer, Jim.
Yeah, I'll give you some links. Yeah, well, definitely, there's links for the Family Forest Carbon Program. There's links on at nature.org for the Vermont program on just carbon markets and carbon information in general. So I'll send those to you.
Great, thanks, Ginevra. The next question is what, I think it probably means how much or what revenues are possible to landowners. I assume a range of so many dollars per acre.
So in the Pennsylvania example, and this, again, we're looking at, oh gosh, I wish I had that number right in front of me here. It's been in the order, I'm gonna have to get back. I don't want to quote a number without double checking it. So
okay, if you want to share that with us, we can share that too.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
And then a second question from the same person, is it possible to integrate agroforestry practices into this program?
Not right now. It's, as you saw, we're sort of narrowed down to like 4 practices. Depending on what you mean by agroforestry, it would all depend on which part of your property and the stands being enrolled. There is a similar protocol starting to be developed for reforestation, and that might fit the bill for that. But right now, we're really looking at kind of the management of these sort of more commercial forest stands.
Okay. The next question is, how would the enrollment in this program impact achieving a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions?
So the way that it would work for net zero, so I'm not sure if they're talking about the state of Vermont or if they're talking about the companies participating in the market. So there's two ways to look at that. One is for the companies, they're going to be doing this, like a carbon plan where they do a comprehensive approach, and then these offsets are used for that last sliver that they can't meet through other ways. So that helps. That's how the companies would be using these credits.
Okay.
State of Vermont, it all depends on what our climate council decides is going to be the goals for the state. And if these credits are sold, they would have to be deducted from that sort of overall accounting that Vermont would be doing of our carbon budget, because we wouldn't want to be double counting credits, that like having Vermont take credit for a tree growing under this program when the credits are actually owned by another entity. So that double counting is a really important thing that we need to avoid.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, is the baseline level of forest carbon based on FIA data in the multi-county project area or on a wider area, say New England and New York?
It's based on the learning area that I showed and for those forest types. So we gathered the FIA data specific to each of those three forest types in the learning pilot area and modeled that out. So the 6 counties in Vermont, Western Massachusetts, and Eastern New York.
And FIA is Forest Inventory Analysis, is that correct?
That is correct. And it's run by the U.S. Forest Service, and it is a big nationwide data set, and it's a treasure trove of information that we can mine for coming up with these kind of models. And then going forward, what's cool about this is that going forward, as these practices get implemented, we'll be able to compare that back to the FIA baseline for what's going on in the region already. Yeah. So it's going to be somewhat adaptable over time, and the credits will vary if we start seeing that baseline change on the FIA plots that are being compared against. And so it's somewhat variable over time how many credits will be generated.
So that FIA data acts as a control almost for...
Absolutely. It helps that really important baseline that shows that these practices are actually adding carbon to the landscape.
Yes. Well, this was a question from our Windsor County retired forester for many years. So that's a good technical forestry question.
I thought I saw John's name. Hey, John.
Is it possible for landowners with the contiguous wooded properties to enroll collectively to meet the 30-acre minimum?
Ooh. I need to get back to you on that. That question has not come up. And I'm going to have to go back and we're going to have to go back and take a look at the protocol and see if that is something that would be possible.
Okay.
I'm going to jot that down.
Oh, I'm waiting for you to jot it down because I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead. No, keep going.
Okay. If carbon offsets from one state are sold to businesses in other states, this means that family forests will not be helping to offset carbon in the state where they grow. Will this be made clear to landowners who are contemplating entering the program?
Yes. It's possible that Vermont companies could buy these credits. There's nothing that would foreclose that, but we can't guarantee that Vermont businesses would buy these or UVM or whatever would purchase these.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. Would planting orchards be considered reforestation?
Possibly, but it doesn't fit in this protocol. So that's when I mentioned that there's another protocol that would use a similar sort of approach for a practice base that is starting to be developed where without knowing all the details of that, or planting an orchard could potentially be something that was, whether there's enough carbon that would be generated from that is another question.
Yeah.
Again, it comes down to how many, your baseline and how much those trees are growing and storing the credits that could be applied from.
And to just for my own, just to take the question even farther, I guess you could say, depending on how heavily you prune those fruit trees, we didn't have carbon storage. I mean, really, you'd have to, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to have somebody model out what the carbon, how much carbon is sequestered and stored through an orchard. They may be out there. I just haven't seen it.
Well, if you're ever interested, I know an orchardist who is very technically oriented and might be interested in something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read a comment here. Suzanne Simard's recent book, Finding the Mother Tree, discusses interconnections between trees brilliantly. That's just a comment from Tim. Also a comment from someone named Neil to answer the revenue question using the Pennsylvania program numbers of 1.6 million over 7,885 acres. It would be approximately $200 per acre, but I know you didn't want to answer that question, so that's just someone's summary.
I like your math, Neil, thanks.
So I'll go to the next question. How does emerald ash borer or other epidemic pathogens that kill trees impact the contracted landowners' management obligations?
Yeah, good question. We, obviously at this point, we're unable to model what like a potential EAB impact might be on that. It again goes back to if there was an outbreak on that property, there could be, you might be looking at a thinning practice or something like that to do that. I don't have a definitive answer for you, but it's a good question for us to consider.
Another question, how does the emerald ash borer or other epidemic pathogens that kill trees impact the contracted landowners' and management obligations?
Wait, is that the same one I just read or no?
It sounds similar.
Yeah, I think that's the same one I just read, Michael.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was typing a message. What options do you know of for landowners who want their carbon credits to remain in Vermont?
Encourage companies that are located here to start adopting principles that are of net carbon neutrality and using these offsets and investing in these offsets. I mean, that's the best approach right now is, or universities. I've had some conversations with municipalities about possibly offsetting their operations. So that's the best approach. And it's quite honestly, it's been a little bit of a challenge with selling credits out of Vermont because we don't have a lot of businesses here that are at the scale where they're buying these credits.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can the carbon reductions achieved through this program count toward Vermont's climate action plan?
Probably not, because they would be already accounted for somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. If a Vermont business were to purchase the credits, would that then be applicable under the?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. My hunch is yes, because it's staying in state, right?
Yeah.
It all depends on how, like, the Climate Council is going to come up with the carbon, the budget for the state, that carbon budget, and what's going to be in and what's out, and how they're going to account for all of that.
Yeah. And then the other question here is the $200 that was referred to in the previous response, is that 200 per acre per year?
No, that would be, that total amount is what is committed to the program over the 20 years. So that,
Okay.
so if, in that case, it would, what we're looking at $20 a year per acre,
Great.
or $10 a year per acre.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
I was like, wait a second.
Wait, the math off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, wow, thank you for that. Like really, yeah, round of questions. Those were fun ones. And yeah, we're at 6:28 right now. So I just do want to call that out. We're almost at our 6:30 time. I'm not seeing any other things popping up in the chat here. Is there anything you felt like you wanted to kind of touch on, Jim?
I want to thank you all for your interest in this. Is, we all know that these are really critical times and it's time for action. We have 10 years by many accounts to really start to bend the curve here. And this is one way to do it. I know offsets can be controversial, but they are a tool. And right now, the best time to be using those is in these early years of trying to bend the curve, because as we get further out, our options, they just become less of a, have less of an impact on the whole picture. So I hope that when we narrow this down and firm this up, that you'll all be knocking on our doors in the fall to sign up, and we'll look forward to having continued conversations with you all as this rolls out.
Thank you, Jim. That's a great presentation.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you, and we'll have follow up with all of you with the links and the answers to some of the questions.
yeah.
And I'd also like to give a shout out to Tim Stout for asking you to present this evening and arranging this. Tim's been doing a tremendous amount with our Forest Carbon Action Group and education and programs. So thanks, Tim. And Ginevra for doing such a great job with the program.
Yeah, you've been a great advocate on all of this, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat as well, Jim. So everyone appreciative. All right. Well,
thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Have a good night.
Take care.